Hello, fellow detectives. Welcome to Unlocked, the official podcast for all things Nancy Drew by Her Interactive. I am your host, Tammy Tuckey, and this week we welcome voiceover artist Kira Dorrian to the show. Welcome, Kira.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the show because you've voiced a couple of different characters for the Nancy Drew games within the past, I'd say, 10 years. You know, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it was a long time ago, but it was really fun.
So was your introduction to Nancy as a character was that like an introduction when you started auditioning for the games, or had you read the books when you were younger?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I have this vivid memory of being in like an old bookstore, like probably a used bookstore when I was like 8 or 9, and finding a Nancy Drew book like tucked away in some box, and like sitting in a corner of this bookshop for what must have been an hour while my parents were browsing or whatever, just like diving into the Nancy Drew book.
Do you remember which one it was? Because there's so many good ones, but...
I know, but it was one of the old covers with like the yellow bar across the top, and I mean, it smelled amazing.
Yes. The smell. Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned the smell.
Absolutely. I can never go over to like Kindles or anything like that. I have to like feel pages in my hand and smell the pages. Oh. It's not the same.
It's such a personal experience when you have it in your hand. And totally. I think that we can compare that to watching a movie in a movie theater as opposed to watching it at home. So
yeah, totally.
You know, it's that personalized experience, especially sometimes when you share it with people. So, but Nancy, when did you hear about the games in particular from friends, or had you played them before the audition call came in?
No, in fact, it was funny how I ended up doing these jobs. So I lived in London for a long time, for like 7 years, right after college. And I came home. My husband and I decided to move back to Seattle. And I went to my 10-year high school reunion. And one of my friends from high school, who I hadn't talked to in 10 years, worked for Her Interactive. And so it came out that I was a voice actor, and I just relocated to Seattle. And she said, "Oh, that's so crazy. We're always hiring voice actors. Why don't you come and audition?" And I said, "Okay." And that's kind of how I got involved.
Was your audition in person then, or did you send over your audition piece?
I think I must have sent them a demo just to kind of let them know what I'd been doing while I was abroad. But the audition itself, the first one, because I only did the one, and then they kind of called you back for other games once you'd worked with them before. But that first audition was in person, which at the time I didn't know was unusual, because in London, all the auditions were in person. But here in Seattle, it's actually almost never happens in person. It's always, you record a clip and you send it in and you kind of wait to hear. But I had just moved back to Seattle and I'd never done voiceover here. So at the time it seemed very normal. But when I look back on it, I'm like, wow, that was really different. And I think in London, it was less about what you looked like, but more about they wanted to meet you and work with you, which in some ways is quite smart, right? They want to see, can you take direction? And it's great that you can like cobble together a fantastic audition, but how long did it take you to make that audition? Whereas in London, I think they move so fast that they really just want to know that you can move at that pace with them.
I think that's a very smart way of doing an audition process. I think it's very interesting. And kind of leading into the first game, which is Shadow at Water's Edge, and you got to play Yumi. Obviously, this character is Asian, so, and you're a white woman. But it sounded like they were looking for a specific sound, and Yumi is such a fun character in general, and I think you brought like that upbeat pep to it. I know they probably wouldn't cast you nowadays, but with Yumi in general, what was the information they gave to you about her character, about who she was and how she was placed in the story?
Well, Tammy, the way that Yumi went down now in the world that we live in, it's so completely inappropriate for me to play this character. But at the time, it wasn't. I went into the audition. They had me read a bunch of stuff, none of which was in a Japanese accent. And at the very, very end, they said, "Hey, could you try and do a Japanese accent?" And I said, "I could try." And they said, "Okay." And they gave me one line. And I read it and they said, "Thanks." And then they called me in and they did not tell me I was coming in to do a Japanese character. So I showed up to this job thinking I was going in with like my voice, and there was an accent coach there, and they said, "Hey, you're going to be playing a Japanese character. Here's your dialect coach." And it was as a voice actor, it was kind of awful because Japanese accent's not in my wheelhouse. It's not on my resume, and I felt like, oh my gosh, this is the job. This is not an audition. Like, I'm here to do the job, and they're expecting me to show up for it. And thank goodness that dialect coach was there. Like, that was so thoughtful of them to bring in a dialect coach. But it was very challenging because I was not prepared. I had not been given any opportunity to prepare for that. And so a lot of it was on the fly, and they were great. They said, what they wanted from her was exactly what you said. Upbeat, like really kind of frantic and frenzied, a higher tone. They wanted her to sound kind of like cute and young. And so that was all totally fine. And then the layering of the accent, they said they wanted her to have an accent, but it didn't have to be a complete accent. They wanted it to sound like, maybe she'd spoken English for a really long time, or she'd grown up partially in an English-speaking country. So they wanted a softer version of the accent. So that helped a lot. But yeah, the whole experience was pretty surprising. Every now and then in voiceover, you have jobs like that. I think especially here, because in London, like we talked about, you've met the people, they've directed you. Here, because so much of it is kind of like you've booked the job, and oftentimes you walk in and you actually have no idea what the job really is. You've maybe read an excerpt of a script. So I think that it's one of those jobs that like I left it in the studio and hoped that it would be received well. And I think it was. Like, I think I probably would have had bad feedback if it had been badly received. And again, if this was now, it would have been completely different.
Hey, it might be just my own ear, and I personally thought I thought you did a really good job for the work that you were given, and I thought the game really meshed well. I read a lot of wonderful reviews about the game. It's very haunting, and such an interesting piece, because I guess a lot of us here in America would never get to experience that type of culture. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't get to travel over there. So it's so unique to have that perspective and all the research that went into the game itself. It felt like, we were a part of that culture.
Like, as an actor, I would have preferred time to like dive into the accent, because at the time it didn't feel inappropriate. And that wasn't even on my radar. Mm-hmm. But I also think that like, we have to be careful not to swing so far in a direction that then nobody's acting, right? Like, I had a friend recently email me, I'm Jewish, and he was like, "Do you think it's okay for me to audition for a Jewish character?" And I was like, yeah, I think that we can't swing so far that nobody's acting anymore. It's called acting for a reason. So,
that's a good point.
There's a really, really blurry line there. And I think as a society, we're just trying to figure it out. We've never really looked at it this way. It's a brand new lens, and we're going to get it wrong sometimes, and we're going to get it right sometimes. And eventually we'll find that, equilibrium. I read a great quote in an article once, and the guy said, "I hope I'm always cringing when I look backwards, because that means I've grown." And Ooh. I think that's so true. I love that perspective. Like, we should be cringing because that means that we're getting better and we're improving.
Yes, I like that. And to think about it, with Her Interactive, they have included, I don't know if you've seen the repertoire of games. I know you've been in a couple of the last few ones, but they've increased that repertoire of diversity with their characters. And I think a lot of people really appreciate that, to have that included. I know they had the Tomb of the Lost Queen had, different types of characters from, different countries and different backgrounds and different religious backgrounds. And it's always a learning process. And
Oh yeah, and her is great. I mean, one of the things I love about just the philosophy behind her is it's for women. It was really like innovative and groundbreaking to develop games specifically for chicks. And I love that. So,
Yes.
I think they're wonderful. Please don't get me wrong. Like I said, it was 10 years ago. We are learning and growing. And they were lovely to work for. I mean, the direction was fantastic. Their character development was fantastic. That's why I went back for more games, because they were a delightful company to be a part of.
And you got to work on another game at the same time, I think, like just some background voices. I think it was for the Captive Curse, right? I think you said you didn't really know where you are in the game, and I was trying to find it, but I couldn't. I think they meshed it so well you can't really define where you are in the game.
Sometimes you like go in it for jobs and you read your few lines, and then at the end they're like, can you give us a couple, like you're getting punched in the stomach, and a couple like, oh, you're scared. And so you get to do all these like random sounds that are going to probably show up in the game at some point.
Now, and I think one of the most unusually set up games in the Nancy Drew repertoire of computer games is the Shattered Medallion, because it's kind of played as if it's a show on TV, kind of like a Survivor, something like that, right? So how did they pitch the game to you with this one?
Again, they didn't. I think with like my experience with voiceover is you just hardly get any information until you're in the room. And that's not just with her, that's across the board, like just the way it rolls. And so when I walked in, and I'd worked with them before, they told me a little bit about the game. They said what you said, like it's going to be kind of Survivor-esque, like a TV show. And then they just talked about my character. And I love this particular character. This is Lina, right?
Correct. Yep. This is Lina. Mm-hmm.
I love this character because they just wanted her to be like too cool for school. Like they just wanted her to have this kind of edge and not really like care on the inside, but seemingly not care on the outside. And that was just kind of fun. Like I tend to do more of the Yumi stuff when I record animation. I tend to sound young, and so they young me up, so I get like even younger sounding. And this was actually just an opportunity to kind of play a character I don't usually get to play. So that was really fun.
Did you get to play this game in particular, like just to see how it ran and how it was very different and felt like a TV show?
No, I have to be honest, I don't play video games at all.
Oh, really?
We don't own a console. Like, we have the games because they lovingly send you one, which is so cool. And so I kept them for my kids, so when they're older, if they want to play it, they can. And be like, that was mom, that's kind of cool. But no, we don't play video games at all.
Oh, okay. Well, hey, it's almost like you could actually just watch it as a TV show. That's how it's kind of played. And I think it's so fun with those interactions because, Lina is just right on top of it. I think she's the main one who really wants to win and is trying to figure out the best way, but not making friends. And, you always have like that one player that is there to win and not to make friends, but make alliances, which is interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what they wanted with that. Like, she cares a lot on the inside, but she's not going to let that show. So she's got this kind of too cool for school veneer to help her move forward.
Of the main interactions, you never got to perform or work with any of the other voiceover cast in this specific game, right?
No, and it's like these days, I mean, even back then it was the case, but even more so these days, you're hardly ever in the room with the other actors, which is so, I understand the logistics of that is complicated. And like you were saying, with time crunches, it's just easier to move through with individual actors. But something is lost when, as an actor, I don't know that the performance gains anything by having everyone in the same room. But I think as actors, the few times that I do get to be in the same room with other people, it's just so much more exciting because you're riffing off each other and seeing what everyone else is doing, and it just informs the script differently, I think.
So when you were in the booth, who were you working with specifically on the voiceovers for these games?
There was a panel, so there was the director, and I want to say some of the writers were there too. There were like 3 or 4 people that were in the room, kind of directing, and they would usually read the lines with me, so that at least you're not just kind of like going wild with your lines. But yeah, not the same as having like a fellow actor in the room. But they were great. I mean, I remember I remember vividly that the direction was excellent from her. Like they knew the characters they were trying to create. They were really good about giving me as an actor the information I needed to create that character, which is not, an easy thing to do. You get a lot of directors that they know what they want in their head, but they can't quite get it out of their mouths to tell you. And I remember her just being really, really good at that.
So you got to play Lina and Yumi, who are both, physical viewing characters in the game. And one of your last roles thus far, which is one of the most recent Nancy Drew games, is for Sea of Darkness as Alex, who was a phone character. So this is a little bit different because it's probably a shorter read, I guess, and process. Did you do anything different with this one? So you could at least know why the calls were being made by Nancy to at least know the full story on this one, or were you in the total dark with the story?
Total dark. And this character, vocally was the closest to me. They didn't really want me to do a ton with my voice. If you compare it to Lina or to Yumi, you can really hear that I sound kind of like myself with this one.
So what's the latest game you're working on now? Because you're one of the few people we've had on the show that continues to do voiceover, besides just,
really? Gosh, I can't, to be totally honest with you, I can't remember the last game I did. I know I did one not too long ago, but I hate to say it. It sounds awful, but it's like, I think when this is your job, you kind of go in, you do the job, and you leave. I know that sounds yuck, but I think it's true. Your first few jobs are so exciting because you've never had them before. And then literally I work, once a week on something. So you do kind of get into a rhythm of work. And so I definitely have a few jobs that stick out, but they're not games. Yeah, I mean, I do a lot in my studio. I have a home studio in my laundry room, and I host 2 podcasts, and I have a big client Dignity Memorial. I do all their national campaigns, and I do a lot of stuff here for Microsoft and car toys, and just like, just the random gigs around town, Amazon, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of voiceover work in Seattle, which is where I'm based. And and I have an agent here, and I have one in LA and one in Atlanta and one in London. So, between all of them, I work a lot, which is great. I'm really grateful. It is literally the coolest job in the world. I feel very, very grateful.
And I'm so glad you mentioned your podcast. Please go ahead and elaborate a little bit more, because I'm sure our listeners would like to hear something other than my voice on occasion.
Well, they're super random, and I tell people all the time, like, you have to hear my whole story to understand how I got to where I'm at today. And I'm not going to bore you with the whole story, but my secondary career alongside voiceover, once I had my kids, I trained as a mental health professional, and I ended up teaching childbirth classes and doing a lot of parent coaching. And so those worlds have kind of merged now. I co-host a parenting podcast called Raising Adults with another parent coach, and we have a brand called Future Focused Parenting and a whole parenting philosophy, just to help families go from surviving into thriving. Like, there really is a way to enjoy parenthood and not feel underwater in it. And so we host this podcast, and every week we talk about a different topic, like chores or manners, grief. We've talked about emotional intelligence. My partner's in a blended family, so we talk about blends sometimes. And kind of back to what we were saying before, my co-host and I are extremely different. So I'm like an agnostic Jew. I lean liberal. She is a Christian who leans conservative. And oftentimes we disagree about things, but we do it really in that open conversation that you were talking about. There's a lot of respect, a lot of kindness, a lot of like genuine listening to each other, which is really exciting. We actually were recently interviewed on a podcast about our relationship. Like, how do you guys do that? So the podcast is really cool. I think we're really proud of it. And we've just had a lot of amazing feedback from parents that are applying the philosophy and really seeing it work. And then my other podcast, again, it seems so random, but I got it through voiceover work. I host an wildlife conservation podcast called the Edge Conservation Podcast. And it's so cool. We interview people who work in conservation all over the world. We're literally in a different country every single week, talking to people who are on the ground, specifically to do with counter poaching. That's Edge. The organization is the Eco Defense Group. That's their focus. But we interview people who are involved in everything. So we've talked to a woman who studied giraffe DNA and a guy who has an elephant preserve. And we've talked to a guy who's changing the world with his coffee company. And like, I'm literally drinking his coffee right now. I only buy his coffee now. The interview was like so mind-boggling. It changed my whole view on coffee. It's incredible. So then that's just me. One of the things we joke about on Raising Adults is I always have a question. Like, I'm a naturally inquisitive individual. And so the Edge podcast is just such a great opportunity for me to just be nosy and ask a lot of questions. Like, tell me more about that. I don't know anything about that. So they're great. They're both really, really cool. Very, very different, but really fun.
And do you have any websites for the actual podcast that we can put in the show notes and you can mention right now so people can go ahead and tune in when they'd like?
Yeah. So for Raising Adults, the website is futurefocusedparenting.com. And the show is called Raising Adults Future Focused Parenting. It's green. It has a big green logo on it. And we're on all major platforms. So anybody who's listening to podcasts can find us on most platforms. And you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Raising Adults Podcast or at Future Focused Parenting. And then for the Edge Conservation Podcast, the website is ecodefensegroup.org. And there is a tab on there for the podcast. It's also on all major podcast platforms. It has a bright orange rhino with earbuds. So the rhino's listening to a podcast, which is pretty cool.
That's cute.
And we don't have a podcast handle, but it's just at Eco Defense Group on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. They're also on Twitter. And yeah, really just very different, but a little something for everyone for sure. Yeah, they're definitely worth checking out.
My last question for you is if you could describe your experience working for this company and being a part of the Nancy Drew universe using one word, what would it be?
Oh, delightful.